What's up? I want to talk to you today about one of the biggest and best super groups there ever were. I know it's a bad word, that word, super group, but this is true. And it's not like those other super groups where it was pure ego and attitude and whatnot. This super group, well, let me say this without giving too much info. I think it's safe to say that that whole genre of classic rock, now that's a bad word, I don't like saying that word, rock and roll, that's all it is, that's proved to be classic, but that whole genre of classic rock could be hoisted upon the shoulders of this band, which I'm going to talk about. One of the biggest selling groups of the 70s, huge debut album. Like I said, classic rock could be built on the shoulders of this band and this album in particular. What am I talking about? Hold on one sec. We are talking about Bad Company. This is the debut album, simply titled Bad Company, released in May 74. Biggest album of their career, contains the biggest hits of their career. Let's talk a little bit about that career, how this album came together, what some of the big things are, what some of the weird things are about this, because you might learn a little something. Let's get into it. Bad Company, Bad Company. You know, Rolling Stone, in their original album review for this in 1974, the album came out in May of 74. Rolling Stone said it was an uncompromising album. And it's even more impressive that it was recorded immediately after the band was formed. The album's rawness will surely draw die-hard rock fans in to listen to it. And they went on to say, Bad Company could become a tremendous band. Could! The album ended up being 5 times double platinum in the US. That's 5 million copies to you and me. Didn't sell as well in Britain, but they were huge in the US, not so much overseas, but massive band nonetheless. Let's talk about this and why this is such a great album. I love this album. Let's talk about this. Okay, now, how did Bad Company, first of all, where'd that name come from? I'm going to tell you about that. Supposedly, Paul Rogers had seen a book about etiquette from the Victorian era, and he was flipping through this book and he saw a picture of this kid kind of standing looking at this really shady guy leaning on a lamppost, and it said, "Stay away from bad company." So now that that's in the bag, let's move on. So how did the band come together? They had actually met in 71. I think Free had kind of fizzled out. And Paul Rogers and Simon Kirke, the drummer from Free, were messing around with something that wasn't really working out, their band at the time. On the other hand, Mick Ralphs, the guitar player, was on the road with Mott the Hoople. And he wasn't really happy with the direction that Mott was going. I think he's more of a rocker. And Mott was starting to go more to that glam phase. So anyway, they met in 71. Him and Paul, Mick and Paul kind of hit it off. And they said, hey, we should do something. But it didn't really transpire until a few years later in 73 when they finally got it together. Funnily enough, the first song that Mick Ralphs brought to or showed Paul Rogers was Can't Get Enough. And ironically, it starts the album off, first song on side one, and it was also the band's biggest single to date. So it's weird that the first song that Mick showed Paul was Can't Get Enough. He also had Ready for Love, which was already recorded that Ian Hunter had, I believe Ian had sang with Mott the Hoople, but of course Paul Rogers did it in a much better way, and we all know that version more than we know Mott the Hoople's. But anyway, Mick kind of came prepared. When they got together and Paul had seen some of these songs, he was like, you know what? The vibe, everything that's happening here, it's just, this is going to be something. And in fact, Simon, the drummer, said, he was really into Mick and he liked Mick's attitude and the way he played. And he had said, I don't want to be around any more superstars. I don't want any more geniuses. You have to remember Paul Kossoff, who played guitar in Free, which was Paul and Simon's original band, was kind of seen as this guitar hero kind of guy. But he was really into drugs and drink, and his attitude, he ended up dying, ODing because of that. But his personality and whatever, like I'm a wonder kid, kind of got on Simon's nerves. So he was like, I didn't want any more geniuses. I just wanted a guy that could play rock and roll. And that's what they got. So we have Simon and Paul, who are coming from Free, and we have Mick Ralphs. What about a bass player? Well, that was Boz Burrell. And he had been in a ton of bands, but he had just been freshly recruited from King Crimson. Now, that's a weird mix-up if you think a dude from King Crimson was in Bad Company. That's crazy. But they all got together, and it all worked. And, even Boz was excited about it when he saw the vibe and whatever. And he said that he was just really excited about it because no one was jaded yet. And it was kind of like being in their first band. So now that we have the whole band together, what next? We have all the guys together. Paul and Mick can write songs. Everybody's vibing off each other. What do we do? Well, it was kind of naive in a way, but Paul Rogers, I guess he kind of carried most of the weight because he was a singer from Free who had just had a big hit with All Right Now. He goes, I have an idea. I'm going to call Peter Grant and ask him to manage us. Now, if you remember, Peter Grant was infamous in the rock and roll world, the big, burly, badass manager of Led Zeppelin who took no crap off anyone. So anyway, believe it or not, Paul does. He gets his nerve up. He calls Peter Grant. He says, hey, Peter, this is Paul from Free. I want to talk to you about managing my new band. I have a new band together, and we're called Bad Company. What do you think if you handle us? And Peter was like, I like the idea. I don't quite like the name, but we'll get to that later. So Peter says, okay, kid, I'll take a chance with you. Now, here's where the story gets interesting. Peter was Led Zeppelin's manager. Led Zeppelin was actually in the process of recording for what would be Physical Graffiti. They were trying to record some new songs for Physical Graffiti. And they were at Headley Grange. You may remember Headley Grange, or you've heard the name. I believe Led Zeppelin 3, 4, Houses of the Holy, and starting to work on Physical Graffiti was all done there in Headley Grange. That's right, Stairway to Heaven. In fact, Stairway to Heaven, supposedly, Robert Plant and Jimmy Page sat down by the fireplace and came up with that. So anyway, Peter Grant says, all right, Paul, because Paul called and said, hey, check out my new band, whatever. So Peter was like, okay, tell you what, we're down at Headley Grange. We have Ronnie Lane's mobile recording unit set up there because Led Zeppelin is working down there. But John Paul Jones got sick. He got the flu. You want to come down, mess around, let me hear what you got? So the band are like, yeah, dude, let's do this. So the band go down to Headley Grange. And because Zeppelin was recording there, they had left all the gear there. So Bonzo's drums are there, Jimmy's guitars are there, John Paul Jones's basses are there. Everything is there because it's Led Zeppelin's joint, right? So I think it was Paul Rogers, no, it may have been Mick Ralphs, was saying that he actually kind of went in and was like, oh, this is Jimmy's guitar, blink, 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 like played it. And anyway, let's get back to the story. Peter's like, all right, what do you got? We're paying for this studio time. Zepp can't make it. Why don't you guys knock a few things out? Believe it or not, in 10 days, the band were there for 10 days. In 10 days, they knocked the album out. Boom. Became one of the best-selling debuts of all time, 5-time double platinum, all in 10 days. 5 songs, 38 minutes, stone cold classic, knocked out just like that. Why? Because of the simplicity of the record. In fact, Simon Kirke said it was really easy. He said everything was just a natural progression. There were no great plans. Just from the time they got together, the songs they heard, the way the songs started to come together with Paul and Mick, it was just a natural progression for the band. And on the other hand, Mick, who was already, like I said, an accomplished guitarist there with Mott the Hoople, he said that he liked to keep things simple and that too much clutter actually makes a record sound small. And Bad Company, as we all know, doesn't sound small at all. Weird thing, right? I told you earlier about when Led Zeppelin recorded Stairway to Heaven there in front of the fireplace. Paul Rogers was saying that there was kind of a communal feel, and well, kind of a hippie communal feel to that 10 days there in Headley Grange. All the instruments were there. He said they actually slept in some of the same rooms where the guitars and the drums were and whatnot. And, you know, it's an old building. I think it was an 18th century workhouse or whatever, but it's old, cold stone walls and whatever. But he said they would all sleep in the rooms with the instruments. They would get up early in the morning, go downstairs, make breakfast. Everybody would eat together. And then after breakfast, go and light the fireplaces to get the place warm so they could get in there and concentrate and make music. It was very hippy dippy. In fact, if you think about it, this record right here was organic before organic became a trend. Anyway, according to rock and roll lore, it was so hippie and laid back that Paul supposedly, he liked to, during the whole process, they like to keep the mics on and tape with as much ambiance and natural sounds as possible. And in fact, it's said that when Paul did the vocals for Bad Company, he actually went out in the middle of a field under a full moon or while the light of the moon is out and sang, getting his nighttime moon vibe on while he was singing Bad Company. Also, he said he woke up one day or couldn't go to sleep, whatever the story is. Again, a late night thing when he wrote Seagull. So there was this nature and sound involved. In fact, he also told a story that they were doing a cut. They were doing the song Do Right by Your Woman, which actually came out on Run with the Pack. It didn't make it onto this album, but it came out with Run with the Pack. But he said they liked the version, but they couldn't use the original version because they actually recorded it around a campfire and there was too much, wood fire popping, crackling going on and whatnot. So anyway, they were trying to be hippies about this, and it turned out to be a very unhippie but very rockin' kind of thing. Now, critics picked up on stuff, on this angle right away, that the band was simple. It was very simple, very straightforward. And listen to the album today and you'll hear that. It's straightforward rock and roll. 4 to the floor, 2 guitars, 1 bass, drum. Very simple. And that's by design in a way, because Mick Ralphs was very straightforward like that. Songs should be simple. He didn't like analogies and double meanings and whatnot. And he said that's what Bad Company was straightforward rock and roll. I believe the exact words he said was ballsy basics. And on the other hand, Paul, who's singing, he had said, like, some critics were deriding him about the simplicity of his lyrics, but he said that's the point. He said, when I write a song, it's about like the way I am in real life. Like if I'm out at a bar talking to a girl and I'm saying, hey, babe, what's going on? Da, da, da. He goes, that's how the song should be. Just straightforward. No hidden meanings, no double entendres. He said he's not trying to change the world overnight. He wanted simple songs that everyone could relate to in their everyday life. And he pretty much accomplished that. So now we have the album. We know how it's made. When it's put out, I got to tell you this. Peter Grant didn't want Bad Company's face. He didn't really want, in the publicity leading up to the release of the album, he didn't want everybody to know or to see who was in the band. So he wanted to kind of keep it, wrapped up tight. And it worked. And that theory actually carried over into the design of the album. This came out in 74. It was right after the whole glam craze. It was kind of fading off. Some of the excess Middle Earth Hobbit stuff is still going on around this time. So he called in Storm Thurgeson from Hypnosis, or should I say, he took the tapes that they recorded over to Storm, and they had to sit down and listen. And Storm was really impressed with the simplicity, just straightforward, basic rock and roll, bringing it all back. In fact, one critic said, how did he say it? It's a Bad Company were an old breath of fresh air for rock and roll. So anyway, Storm thought the same. And keeping in mind with what Peter Grant was saying, he didn't want like the band's picture and everybody to know who was in the band, because he wanted the band to be accepted not as Was Free, Was Mott the Hoople, but as Bad Company. So Storm listened to the tapes and he said, I have an idea. let's pull it all back, keep it simple, solid black, just the band name on the front. If you think about it, this came out in 74. 6 years later, AC/DC did a solid black album cover on Back in Black. And then a few years after that, Metallica did a solid black. And then Prince had a solid black. So anyway, if we're looking at it that way, Hypnosis kind of set the trend for this with this basic simplicity, with just the band's name, Bad Company. Of course, when you open it up, you get to see the band in full color. Here we have Paul, Boz, Mick, and Simon. Anyway, for the longest time, and like I told you, I love this record, and it's a great record. I still love this record. I would look at this. I love the logo. I love the design. But I kept looking at this, and I was like, if you look closely inside these letters, I never could figure that out. I was like, what is that? It's kind of like a baseball skin, or what is that crinkledy stuff inside there? Come to find out, Storm, who designed the album cover, had an idea. Since the band's name was Bad Co., he used thumbprints and overlaid thumbprints on the inside of that logo. Get it? Thumbprints, Bad Company, usually gets in trouble, go to jail, put your thumbprint down. So there we have it. Bad Company. A lot of people think this was the first album put out on Led Zeppelin's Swan Song label. I forgot to mention that earlier, that at the time they were doing Physical Graffiti, around that time Led Zeppelin were starting a label. And of course, everybody knows the famous label. But this actually isn't the first album on the Swan Song label. I happen to have a copy of the one that is, and that was The Pretty Things, was actually the very first record released on Swan Song. But technically, this came out in England first. I don't know if it came out in the US, but it came out in England, and this came out in the US. So this was the first album released in the US on that label, but technically the second album released on Swan Song. And weirdly enough, Bad Company's Rough Diamonds, I believe it was the second to the last album released on Swan Song. Go figure. Bad Company became a classic right off the bat. Like I said, one of the biggest selling artists of the 70s, huge concert draw, classic album. Only 8 songs, 35 minutes, can't get enough, rock steady, awesome. Ready for Love, Don't Let Me Down, nice ballad, great. Bad Company, I'm kind of sick of that song actually. Way I Choose, great. Moving On, song about being on the road. And of course, Seagull, which I told you about, Paul wrote at nighttime when he just was hit with it. Listed in some of the great 1001 albums you must hear. Kerrang listed it in one of the 100 greatest heavy metal albums of all time, although it's not really heavy metal, just solid rockin'. But I want to read in closing real quick what one critic, I forgot where this is from, excuse me for that, but listen to what this critic said about this gem right here. And this is true. When I read this, I thought, wow, it's so true about this band and about this record. Bad Company. They weren't the first and they weren't the best of all rock and roll supergroups springing to life in the late 90s of the, let me try that again. They weren't the first and they weren't the best. But of all the rock and roll supergroups that sprung to life in the late 1960s and have continued unabashedly until today, Bad Company may be the most definitive. That's because, this is what's great about what this critic said, that's because Bad Company didn't necessarily place the emphasis on super, but rather on group. Bad Company, fantastic album. What do you think?